to read you another story because it's story time with Stephanie because we can't be together. So today's story comes from this magazine. It's called The Journal of the American Medical Association. There's lots of different stories in here, but the one I'm going to read to you today is called Diagnostic Testing for the Novel Coronavirus. Now, as you may know, there's this crazy pandemic going on in the world right now, and it's one of the reasons why I can't come visit you, because I'm all the way here in Connecticut and you're in North Dakota. So just to kind of give you a little bit of an idea of what we're dealing with, I'm going to read you this story. Diagnostic Testing for the Novel Coronavirus by Joshua M. Sharfstein, M.D., Scott J. Becker, M.S., and Michelle M. Mello, J.D., Ph.D. Controversies over diagnostic testing have dominated U.S. headlines about severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, or SARS-CoV-2, the novel coronavirus responsible for coronavirus disease 2019, or COVID-19. Technical challenges with the first test developed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, left the nation with minimal diagnostic capacity during the first few weeks of the epidemic. The CDC also initially limited access to testing to a narrow group of individuals with known exposure. The delayed discovery of a case of COVID-19 in California, followed quickly by the evidence of community transmission in multiple states, revealed the shortcomings of this strategy. In the early stages, COVID-19 has spread beyond the nation's ability to detect it. On February 29th, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, FDA, moved to expand testing capacity by eliminating a requirement that advanced laboratories obtain prior FDA authorization before using their own laboratory-developed test. Then, on March 3rd, Vice President Pence announced the removal of all federal limitations on testing, stating that, subject to doctors' orders, any American can be tested. These steps left many with questions about what had happened with testing and what should happen next. Unraveling the situation requires understanding how the regulatory structure for diagnostic tests interacts with public health emergencies. It also involves appreciating the distinction between testing capacity for public health surveillance and clinical care. While the public may want extensive testing, the usefulness of testing is greater in some scenarios than in others. It is important to balance two concepts. Remedying testing gaps is imperative, yet more testing is not always better. Understanding the testing gap. The basis of diagnosis for new viruses is the reverse transcriptase polymerase chain reaction, or RT-PCR test, used to identify genetic material in many clinical samples. This is the same test, Quinn, that they use to find murderers and do genetic testing. I'm sure you've watched a lot of those Forensic Files episodes with your dad. The CDC developed a protocol for RT-PCR that included specific primers designed to bind to key areas of the novel coronavirus. FDA authorized CDC's test via an emergency use authorization, through which the FDA permits use of non-FDA approved drug or device to respond to a declared emergency. The CDC quickly shipped the test to state and local public health laboratories, given the urgent need to supply public health surveillance by identifying new cases around the country. The CDC test differed in some respects from a test developed at the same time by the Robert Koch Institute in Germany and adopted by the World Health Organization, or the WHO. As soon as the test kits arrived, however, many state laboratories encountered difficulty verifying the results. Some of the expected results came back as inconclusive or invalid due to failure of the negative control. The source of these problems remains under investigation. That CDC test doesn't sound too good, does it, Quinn? The RT-PCR test is performed in many laboratories across the country for a variety of different clinical diagnoses, and laboratories could have tested using the WHO's recommended protocol and primers, which sounded like a better test. However, FDA made clear that laboratories were encouraged to develop tests that could not use them for clinical diagnosis without FDA's approval, clearance, or authorization during emergency declaration. On February 24th, recognizing that inadequate access to testing was hindering response efforts, frustrated state laboratories asked the FDA for permission to develop and use their own tests. FDA initially directed the state laboratories first to submit an EUA application, but reversed course within days under growing pressure to expand testing capacity for patient care. On February 29th, FDA began permitting coronavirus testing using laboratory-developed tests without prior agency approval. Laboratories certified to perform high-complexity testing could begin testing patient samples using their own tests after showing that they took certain basic steps to validate them, so long as the laboratory submitted an EUA application within 15 days. Since the FDA announcement, the New York State Laboratory announced that it had received an EUA test for the novel coronavirus. As of March 5th, other laboratories are expected to begin testing soon, and it is anticipated that testing will be far more available nationwide by mid-March. Regulation of laboratory-developed tests in an emergency. Testing for SARS-CoV-2 highlights a controversial area of public policy, the regulation of laboratory-developed tests, in which there has been long tension between the goals of access and quality. Outside of emergency context, FDA largely does not regulate laboratory-developed tests, leaving major gaps in oversight of test accuracy and validity. In fact, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services regulates the quality of laboratory operations and certain aspects of analytical validity of laboratory-developed tests. In 2014, during the Obama administration, FDA proposed but did not finalize draft guidance that would have required laboratories to submit evidence to the agency for certain high-risk tests. The Trump administration did not proceed with this effort, and in recent years, the debate over regulation of laboratory-developed tests has shifted to Congress. Most recently, in draft legislation called the Verifying Accurate Leading-Edge IVCT Development Act. The VALID Act. That's clever. During declared emergencies, the regulatory terrain for laboratory-developed tests is different. In such circumstances, under the Project BioShield Act of 2004, FDA has a broad discretion about which laboratory tests can be used for the response. For the novel coronavirus, FDA chose to limit the initial approval to the CDC test for the purpose of ensuring accurate surveillance testing by state and local public health laboratories. The failure of this test, however, put into sharp relief the risks of this strategy, inadequate capacity to conduct surveillance, as well as a challenge to scale up quickly should the test be needed broadly for clinical care. Evidence suggests that containment of COVID-19 may depend on early case detection and contact tracing. It is notable that an administration that chose not to proceed with greater oversight of laboratory-developed tests, absent an emergency, also chose to restrict testing substantially in case of the coronavirus, even after professional societies expressed concern in 2016 about access to testing in an emergency. While the latest FDA action to permit some testing prior to review is understandable under difficult circumstances, this policy has introduced its own risks. It will be crucial for the FDA to identify and quickly address any testing errors by laboratories and review EUA applications quickly. The agency should also reassess the new approach as testing becomes more available and transparently review its experience to develop future policy for public health emergencies. Who should be tested? The current situation exemplifies the challenges of how to best utilize testing during outbreaks of novel pathogens. The initial testing criteria were too narrow to monitor and control the spread of the disease, but the sudden pivot to a far broader testing approach, even as capacity remains limited, may be an overcorrection. As of March 4th, CDC discontinued specific guidance and recommendations that clinicians should use their own judgment to determine if a patient has signs and symptoms compatible with COVID-19 and whether the patient should be tested, advising that decisions on which patients receive testing should be based on local epidemiology of COVID-19 as well as the clinical course of the illness. High priorities for testing include patients with serious, unexplained respiratory illnesses and contacts of known cases. In March 2020, numerous patients with mild, nonspecific symptoms of COVID-19 have called for testing in clinical offices and on social media. There is a risk that widespread testing and test seeking will overwhelm medical services needed for patients who have more severe symptoms. Furthermore, once in the waiting room for the test, a patient with mild or no illness may actually be exposed to the coronavirus from infected patients. A related concern is misunderstanding results. Given the disease's incubation period, 2 to 14 days, a negative result does not rule out infection, particularly for people with a known exposure. A positive result in an otherwise well or mildly ill patient does not require urgent medical attention, but does require isolation at this time. Accurate communications will be essential to avoid confusion. Innovative approaches to testing, such as drive-through testing, should be considered. But testing is not suitable for other steps to control the spread of the virus, such as hand washing, isolation when indicated, and appropriate social distancing measures. Conclusion. Diagnostic testing is crucial to an effective response to the novel coronavirus. As the U.S. moves to make up for initial missteps, emerging evidence should guide policy and practice. The public health and medical community should recognize the need to alter policy to fit changing circumstances and support consistent and compassionate messaging that recognizes both the benefits and limitations of testing. Unfortunately, there's no pictures in this story, so I can't really show you any pictures, but I hope you enjoyed today's reading about the novel coronavirus and diagnostic testing. I hope you learned a lot, and hopefully I'll see you soon in another story time with Stephanie. Bye, Quinn!